For this project, you will need thicker, heavyweight paper. It can be watercolor paper, cardstock, or illustration board. You will also need a permanent marker and something to place underneath your paper to protect your work surface. Using permanent marker on regular sheets of paper is not a good idea because it will bleed straight through your paper. So be sure to use thicker paper and protect your work surface as well. You could use an old magazine, newspaper, scrap paper, or anything else that you are not worried about getting inked. So make sure you have a nice setup and have your black permanent marker ready, as well as potentially a pencil and eraser. We will add color in part 2. So with that, let's get started. To create optical art, or optical illusion art, is to essentially provide the illusion of rhythm, movement, and space through the use of lines, colors, and patterns. To start, you can use pencil until you become comfortable. I, however, am going to start with a black permanent marker. This first type of optical illusion looks almost like a tunnel or a starburst effect. It is probably the simpler of the two designs that I will show, so the choice is yours. You can see the second option later in this video. The first step is to divide your paper into at least 6 sections. It doesn't matter where you start on your paper, as long as your lines intersect at the same single point. If you are unsure of the placement of your lines, remember you can always start this step using pencil first, and then trace with the black marker. You can even use a ruler or straight edge to make your lines perfectly straight. But you don't have to as long as you're careful. It's also okay to have more than 6 sections, so you can play around with your spacing. Next, start in the middle of your intersection and draw curved lines, working your way around like a clock. Each one should touch your previous line, so you should have a pattern that looks like a flower. Continue working your way around and adding more lines. Remember, don't get lazy and stop partway. It shouldn't look like bands of a rainbow. Each line should curve and meet in the corners created by those previous lines. So take your time to meet each line. Continue adding lines and working your way around until you've completely filled in the space of your paper. And this concludes option 1. In option 2, you have a bit more freedom in your design, though it may pose some new challenges. I like to call this design the tornado columns. First, you want to turn your paper horizontally and divide your paper into 2 sections with a smooth, wavy line. In this next step, you may want to try in pencil first in case you make any sort of mistakes. Then you can always switch to the marker, retrace, and continue that way. So for this step, you're going to pretend that you're bouncing a ball all the way across this wavy line. So notice how I'm drawing some spaced apart lines, and it looks like it has the curve or arc of a bouncing ball all the way across. And I'm making sure that I again have 6 or more sections drawn. These are the very beginnings for our tornado columns. So you can play around with the spacing just a little bit. And then you're going to do the same thing and match those same curves on the underside of this wavy line. Take your time to draw your line all the way down and touch those intersections. Now is when we start to turn these little sections into actual columns. So I'm going to start adding more lines above my previous lines, making sure that I'm always drawing that line back down into that original intersection. As you are continuously adding these new lines, it's also a good idea to keep in mind of the space in between those lines. Because remember, we are going to eventually add color to these. So you don't want a massive amount of space in between them, but you also don't want them to be as thin as, say, like a razor blade. So make sure it's a reasonable amount of space in between. And also remember, don't get too lazy with your lines. We're not creating rainbows. They shouldn't stop part of the way. Your line should always go back down into those previous valleys and intersections. When you start to get the hang of things, you may want to create wider columns in certain areas to add more interest in your design. So I'm going to focus on this center column and continuously build up those lines and gradually make it wider. So notice how I'm still working in those valleys, but I'm carrying my band wider outwards. Just remember when you do this that the other columns side by side are going to squish inward. So you don't want those to get totally squished. So keep in mind of your spacing, and then you can start to widen those as you see fit to your design. So if you notice one spot is getting a little bit small, a little bit tight squished together, then you can start to add lines into that one and continue to build your columns more individually. Continue to add those lines until you reach all the way to the edges of your paper. And again, it is nice to have something underneath to protect your work surface so you don't get marker on your table. Once you're done with the first half, you'll continue on to the second half. And it looks like my project is walking away from me a little bit. And this wraps it up for the drawing portion of our optical illusion designs. Stay tuned for part 2 where we will add color. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.